The courtroom was a cavern of silence, oppressive and suffocating. Every shuffle of paper echoed like thunder. Every throat-clearing reverberated as if amplified. Devon sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He tried to appear composed, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. The room brimmed with spectators, some who knew him, others who didn't, but all drawn by the gravity of the case that had consumed the small city of Austin, Texas. His family occupied a few rows back. His younger sister, Maya, gripped their mother's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Maya, barely 20, looked like she was on the verge of tears, biting her lip to hold them back. Their mother's face, however, remained unreadable, a mask of quiet strength. Neither spoke. What could they say? Words felt useless here, hanging limp in the charged air. At the front of the room, the prosecutor arranged his notes with deliberate precision, a confident smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. To him, this hearing was already over. The outcome etched in stone. The court clerk stood nearby, notepad ready, prepared to record every word that would seal Devon's fate. Then, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Judge Ronald Green entered. Instinctively, the room rose to its feet. Green's reputation preceded him. To those in law enforcement, he was a hero, a symbol of order and authority. But to others, especially those who stood before him, he was a grim reminder of how swiftly and decisively the justice system could take everything from you. "Be seated," Green said curtly, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. He settled into his chair, adjusting his robe with practiced ease. His expression gave nothing away as he scanned the room, his gaze briefly landing on Devon before shifting to the documents in front of him. The charges were clear: armed robbery and assault. According to the prosecution, Devon had entered a convenience store late one night, brandished a weapon, attacked the clerk, and fled with a handful of cash. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before convicting him. Now, only sentencing remained, a mere formality, it seemed, as the prosecutor pushed for the maximum sentence of 50 years. Devon's attorney whispered something to him, but he barely heard it. His eyes remained fixed on the judge, unblinking, as if willing him to see beyond the pages of the case file. Devon wasn't naive. He knew the odds were stacked against him. His public defender had done her best, but the evidence, or lack thereof, had been overshadowed by assumptions. A system eager to close the case had left little room for doubt. Judge Green cleared his throat and began, "This court is convened for the purpose of sentencing the defendant, Devon Carter. The jury has found the defendant guilty on all counts. Is there anything the defense wishes to say before I proceed?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Devon glanced at his lawyer, who nodded slightly. Slowly, he rose to his feet. Would his legs hold him? They did. He turned to the judge, his voice steady despite the tightness in his chest. "Your Honor, I didn't do this," Devon said, his voice firm but calm. "And if you'll let me, I'd like to tell you why." The room shifted almost imperceptibly. Spectators leaned forward, curiosity piqued despite themselves. The prosecutor rolled his eyes, but Judge Green's expression didn't change. He gestured for Devon to continue, his tone clipped. "You have 5 minutes." Devon swallowed hard. Those 5 minutes could mean the difference between losing his life to the system and having a fighting chance. But what Devon didn't know was that those 5 minutes were about to change everything. Devon's story began on an ordinary evening, one that didn't seem destined for anything but routine exhaustion. He had just finished his second shift at the shipping warehouse, where long hours left his back aching and his mind clouded with fatigue. The warehouse was his lifeline, a place where he earned just enough to support his sister, Maya, who was studying hard in her first semester of college, and his mother, who worked part-time cleaning offices. They didn't have much, but they made it work. That night, Devon had clocked out at 12:07 a.m. The glow of the warehouse's fluorescent lights reflected off his gray hoodie. He waved goodbye to a coworker as he walked to his car, an old Honda Civic that had seen better days but was reliable enough to get him home. His mind was on the leftovers waiting in the fridge and the few precious hours of sleep he'd managed before another long day. but he never made it home. As Devin turned onto East 7th Street, red and blue flashes lit up his rearview mirror. He sighed, pulling over immediately, confused but calm. The officer approached his window, flashlight beaming directly into his eyes. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone sharp and authoritative. Devin complied, handing over his documents without hesitation. "Did I do something wrong, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but respectful. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he glanced at Devin's gray hoodie and muttered something into his radio. Moments later, another patrol car pulled up, and Devin found himself surrounded. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered. Devin hesitated, startled. "Is there a problem?" "Step out now." The next moments felt like a blur. Before he could process what was happening, Devin was pulled from the car, his hands yanked behind his back as cold metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The pavement beneath him was rough, the smell of oil and asphalt filling his nose as he lay face down. "You're under arrest for armed robbery and assault," the officer said matter-of-factly, as if this were just another box to check off on his nightly rounds. Devin's heart raced. "What robbery?" "I didn't save it for the judge," the officer interrupted, hauling him to his feet. The explanation for Devin's arrest came only after he was sitting in the back of the squad car, staring out at the city lights that suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. A convenience store, just a few blocks from where he was stopped, had been robbed an hour earlier. The clerk, now recovering from minor injuries, had described the suspect as a tall black man in a gray hoodie. Vague, yes, but to the police, it was enough. The evidence against him was thin. Surveillance footage showed a man in a hoodie entering, brandishing what appeared to be a gun, and striking the clerk before fleeing with cash from the register. The footage was grainy, the man's face obscured, but the hoodie and vague description matched Devin. Paired with his proximity to the crime scene, it seemed damning enough to the officers who arrested him. Devin tried to explain. He'd been at work, surrounded by co-workers, and had even clocked out on time. But no one listened. The officers seemed uninterested in his protests, their minds already made up. Within hours, Devin was booked, fingerprinted, and sitting in a cold holding cell, trying to piece together how his life had spiraled so quickly. When he was finally assigned a public defender, the conversation was brief and unpromising. "You're looking at some serious time here," the lawyer said, her voice detached as she scanned the file. "The prosecution is going to push hard. It's a high-profile case." "But I was at work," Devin insisted. "My supervisor can prove it." "My co-workers," the lawyer sighed. "We'll do what we can, but cases like this, they're tough. Juries tend to trust eyewitnesses." And so, in what felt like the blink of an eye, Devin's trial came and went. The eyewitness's shaky testimony was enough to sway the jury. The prosecutor painted him as a criminal with a cold heart and a violent streak. His public defender did what she could, but with limited time and resources, Devin's defense was a shadow of what it should have been. Now, sitting in court awaiting his sentence, Devin replayed those moments over and over in his head, searching for the point where things could have gone differently. But all he could do now was hope that the truth would somehow find its way to the surface. What Devin didn't know was that his voice was about to force the courtroom to take a second look at everything they thought they knew. The courtroom felt like a vacuum, every sound amplified yet muffled by the weight of what was unfolding. Devin stood at the defense table, his knuckles white as they gripped its edge. His voice had been steady when he began speaking, but now it carried an urgency that demanded attention. "Because I didn't do this," he said, his words cutting through the charged air like a knife. "I've been saying that since the day I was arrested, and no one has taken the time to hear me." Judge Green leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable, though something flickered in his eyes, curiosity perhaps? A crack in his usual stoicism? "You have 5 minutes, Mr. Carter," he said, his tone firm but measured. "Use them wisely." Devin glanced at his lawyer, her face tense with anticipation. Then his gaze shifted to the spectators behind him, his mother and sister, sitting near the back. Their faces were etched with worry, their hands clasped tightly together as if holding onto each other could keep them from crumbling. He turned back to the judge, drawing in a deep breath. "Thank you," he said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and resolve. "Here's what really happened." What followed would shift the entire focus of the courtroom. The cracks in the case began to widen under the weight of Devon's truth. He paused for a moment, steadying himself, glancing briefly at his family. Maya gave him the faintest nod, her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands still gripping their mother's. Turning back to Judge Green, Devon inhaled deeply and began. "Your Honor, on the night of the robbery, I was at work," he said, his voice unwavering despite the storm inside him. "I work at a shipping warehouse on the east side of town. I clocked in at 4 in the afternoon and didn't leave until just after midnight. The records are there, they can prove it." The judge raised an eyebrow but remained silent, signaling Devon to continue. "I wasn't anywhere near that convenience store," Devon went on, his voice rising slightly as frustration bubbled beneath the surface. "But the cops didn't care. They stopped me because I fit some vague description, a tall black man in a hoodie. I guess that was enough." The courtroom murmured softly, but Devon's voice rose above the whispers, sharp and clear. "When I was arrested, I told them to check my phone records, my GPS, anything to prove where I was, but they didn't bother. They just saw someone who fit their story and ran with it." He paused, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the gazes of those who dared to look at him. "The prosecutor said I was violent, that I hurt that store clerk. But I've never been in trouble a day in my life. I've been working since I was 16, trying to help my mom keep a roof over our heads. That's all I've ever cared about, taking care of my family." His hand tightened on the edge of the table, steadying himself as his voice softened. "My public defender tried her best, but she didn't have the time or the resources to really fight for me. She told me the system wasn't built for people like me, and she wasn't lying. I've been guilty in everyone's eyes since the day I was arrested." Turning his gaze directly to Judge Green, Devon's voice grew firmer, more resolute. "I get that the jury made their decision, but they didn't get to hear everything. My supervisor was ready to testify, but no one called her. The surveillance footage from my job's parking lot could prove I was there, but no one requested it. And the eyewitness, the only person who said they saw me, was pressured into identifying me. My mom talked to her after the trial, and she admitted it." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, the tension thickening with every word. Devon's lawyer stepped forward, handing a folded letter to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "That's from my supervisor," Devon explained, nodding toward the letter. "She couldn't be here because her husband's in the hospital, but she wrote this to confirm everything I've told you. She knows I was at work that night, and so do my coworkers." Judge Green unfolded the letter and began to read, his expression inscrutable. Devon stood silently, his chest rising and falling with each measured breath. The courtroom seemed frozen, every eye on the judge as he finished reading and set the letter down. Finally, Devon spoke again, his voice quieter but no less powerful. "I know I'm just another case file to most people, but this is my life. I'm asking you to look at the facts, not just the story they've been telling. If I go to prison for something I didn't do, what does that say about this system? About all the other people it's failed?" The room fell utterly silent, the weight of Devon's words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Judge Green didn't respond immediately, his pen tapped softly against his desk as he processed what he'd just heard. But in that silence, something shifted, a crack in the courtroom's rigid order, a moment where doubt began to creep into even the most resolute minds. For a moment, the courtroom sat in stunned silence, suspended in time. Even the prosecutor, who had exuded confidence throughout the hearing, looked momentarily shaken. He shuffled through his notes, his lips pressing into a thin line, as if trying to find the argument that would restore control over the narrative. But Judge Green remained still, his sharp gaze fixed on Devon. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses with a deliberate motion. "Mr. Carter," he said evenly, "you've raised serious concerns about the integrity of this case. However, the court operates on evidence, not emotion. If you have proof to back up these claims, now is the time to present it. Devon's lawyer stood, her voice steady but charged with urgency. Your Honor, we've been trying to present that evidence since the beginning. Requests to subpoena Devon's employment records and GPS data were denied during pretrial motions. We even attempted to retrieve additional surveillance footage from the parking lot where Devon works, but those motions were also blocked. The judge's brow furrowed. Blocked on what grounds? He asked, his tone sharp. Time constraints and procedural technicalities, she replied, her voice laced with frustration. Your Honor, this case was rushed through the system. The evidence that could exonerate my client was dismissed before it could even be reviewed. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a wave of disbelief sweeping through the spectators. Judge Green silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel, his eyes narrowing as he turned to the prosecutor. Mr. Aldridge, do you have anything to say in response? The prosecutor stood, visibly bristling. Your Honor, the evidence presented at trial was sufficient for the jury to reach a unanimous verdict. The defense is attempting to muddy the waters with last-minute claims that lack credibility. The eyewitness identified the defendant, and the surveillance footage, while not perfect, supports that identification. Judge Green's voice cut through like a blade. Eyewitness testimony is not infallible, Mr. Aldridge. And if the defense was denied the opportunity to present evidence that could potentially exonerate the defendant, this court has an obligation to address it. The tension in the room was palpable, all eyes on Judge Green as he tapped his pen against the desk, his expression deep in thought. Finally, he looked up at Devon's lawyer. Miss Ellis, you mentioned an eyewitness who spoke to the defendant's mother after the trial. Is this individual available to testify? Yes, Your Honor, the lawyer replied quickly. She's here today and willing to address the court. The judge nodded. Bring her forward. The courtroom doors opened, and a woman in her late 40s stepped in, clutching her purse tightly against her chest. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room as she made her way to the stand. After being sworn in, she introduced herself as Teresa Grayson, the clerk who had initially identified Devon as the robber. Under questioning, Teresa's voice trembled, revealing the cracks in the foundation of the prosecution's case. The storm inside the courtroom was barely contained by the authority of the gavel. Emotions swirled like a tempest, each gasp and murmur a ripple in the growing tide of doubt. The cracks in the case against Devon were no longer theoretical, they were visible, undeniable. For the first time, uncertainty hung heavy in the air, thick enough to choke on. And it was Judge Green who broke the silence, his voice measured but firm. Miss Grayson, he said, his gaze fixed on the trembling eyewitness, your testimony today carries significant implications. If your identification of Mr. Carter was influenced or uncertain, this court has a duty to address it. He turned sharply to the prosecutor. Mr. Aldridge, do you have any objections to revisiting the evidence in light of this new information? The prosecutor hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. His face flushed as he stammered, Your Honor, the jury's verdict was based on the evidence presented at trial. Revisiting this now undermines the integrity of the process. Green's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing into slits. What undermines the integrity of this process, he countered sharply, is the possibility of convicting an innocent man because critical evidence was dismissed or overlooked. This court is not in the business of closing cases at the expense of justice. A hush fell over the room, so profound that even the faintest shuffle of paper felt deafening. The judge turned to Devon's lawyer, his tone resolute. Miss Ellis, I'm granting your motion to review all previously denied evidence. I want the employment records, the GPS data, and the surveillance footage from Mr. Carter's workplace submitted within the next 48 hours. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into the procedural decisions made during the pretrial phase. The courtroom erupted again, murmurs swelling into a chaotic buzz, a mix of astonishment and disbelief. Devon sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. His lawyer placed a reassuring hand on his arm, her expression a blend of relief and determination. But the drama wasn't over yet. Green leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping but carrying the weight of his authority. And one more thing, the officers involved in Mr. Carter's arrest will be subpoenaed to explain why these avenues of investigation were not pursued. The prosecutor stood abruptly, his face red with indignation. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. It's justice, Mr. Aldridge, Green interrupted sharply, cutting him off mid-protest. If you have concerns about the court's integrity, I suggest you direct them toward ensuring that every case brought before me is handled with the thoroughness it deserves. Defeated, the prosecutor sank back into his seat, his jaw clenched tightly. In the gallery, Devon's sister Maya let out an audible sob, collapsing into their mother's embrace. It was a small victory, but for the first time in months, hope flickered in the hearts of those who had fought tirelessly for Devon. Green addressed the courtroom, his voice ringing out like a final decree. This hearing is adjourned until all new evidence has been reviewed. Mr. Carter will remain in custody pending further proceedings. However, I want to make one thing clear, this court will not proceed with sentencing until we are certain, beyond all reasonable doubt, that justice has been served. As the gavel came down, the room buzzed with renewed energy. Reporters scrambled to file their stories, spectators whispered furiously, and Devon sat quietly, absorbing the weight of what had just transpired. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope, not just for himself, but for what this moment could mean for others like him. As the bailiffs let him out, he glanced back at his family. Maya gave him a small, tearful smile, and their mother mouthed the words, "We're with you." Devon nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, it felt like the truth might finally have its day. The courtroom had shifted from a place of condemnation to one of possibility. The cracks in the system were no longer hidden, they were wide open for all to see. 3 weeks passed as the new evidence was gathered, analyzed, and prepared for presentation. During that time, Devon sat in his cell, the minutes crawling by like hours. Each tick of the clock echoed in the suffocating stillness, amplifying the fragile hope clinging to his heart. Would the truth set him free? Or would the system once again prove too rigid, too blind to bend toward justice? Word of the case had spread far beyond the confines of the courtroom. Local activists rallied around Devon's story, while national organizations advocating for criminal justice reform took notice. Devon's name became part of a larger conversation, a symbol of the countless individuals swallowed whole by a system that too often failed the very people it was meant to protect. When the courtroom reconvened, the tension was palpable. The gallery overflowed with spectators, reporters lined the walls, and cameras clicked incessantly. Every eye was fixed on the front of the room, where Devon sat silently, his hands clasped tightly together. This was it, the moment when the truth would either crumble under the weight of assumptions or rise triumphantly above them. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation, each breath held collectively as Judge Green entered the room. His presence commanded silence, his expression unreadable as he settled into his chair. Papers shuffled, whispers faded, and the world seemed to pause, waiting for the next chapter in this unfolding drama. The courtroom was a crucible of emotions, every face in the gallery etched with anticipation. Devon's family sat in the front row, their expressions a delicate blend of hope and fear. His mother clutched Maya's hand so tightly it seemed she might break it, while his sister's wide eyes shimmered with unshed tears. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Then, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, and Judge Green entered. His presence commanded immediate silence, as if the room itself held its breath. This time, though, his demeanor was less severe, his face still unreadable, but there was something softer in the way he carried himself. As he reviewed the new materials submitted by the defense, Devon sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His lawyer, Miss Ellis, glanced at him with quiet confidence, her file thick with evidence she had fought tirelessly to gather. Across the aisle, the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier bravado noticeably diminished. The once smug smirk was gone, replaced by a furrowed brow and restless fidgeting. Judge Green began, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. This court has reviewed the new evidence submitted by the defense, including employment records, GPS data, and surveillance footage from the defendant's workplace. He paused, letting the words settle over the room. It has also taken into account the testimony of the eyewitness, Miss Grayson, who has since recanted her identification of Mr. Carter as the perpetrator of this crime. The courtroom was silent, every word landing like a stone on the collective chest of the spectators. You could hear the faint rustle of fabric, the occasional intake of breath, but nothing more. The judge continued, his tone unwavering. The evidence conclusively places Mr. Carter at his place of employment at the time of the robbery. Another pause, deliberate and measured. Furthermore, the handling of this case, including the denial of critical motions and the pressure placed on the eyewitness, raises serious concerns about the integrity of the investigation. Devon's heart pounded in his chest, each beat reverberating through his body like a drum. His breath caught somewhere between hope and fear, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Was this real? Could it be possible? It is the finding of this court, Green said, his voice steady and resolute, that the conviction of Devon Carter was based on insufficient and flawed evidence. As such, the conviction is hereby overturned, and all charges against Mr. Carter are dismissed. For a moment, the room was frozen in stunned silence. Then, like a dam breaking, cheers erupted from the gallery. Devon's mother wept openly, clutching Maya as tears streamed down both their faces. Maya buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her sobs muffled but audible. Devon himself sat motionless, the words washing over him as if they weren't real. When the reality finally hit, he exhaled shakily, his eyes brimming with tears that threatened to spill over. Judge Green rapped his gavel sharply to restore order, though a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. Mr. Carter, he said, addressing Devon directly, his tone carrying a rare warmth, on behalf of this court, I apologize for the failures that led to your wrongful conviction. I hope you will take this second chance and use it to continue being the man you've shown yourself to be, a man of integrity and resilience. Devon stood, his legs trembling slightly beneath him. His voice was choked with emotion as he spoke. Thank you, Your Honor, not just for this, but for listening. For seeing me. The words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, before dissolving into the hum of activity around them. As the courtroom emptied, Devon walked out a free man, greeted by his family with open arms. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, but for Devon, none of it mattered. He had his life back, and with it, a renewed purpose. The embrace of his mother and sister felt like the first real warmth he'd known in months, their tears mingling with his own. The case became a rallying cry for justice reform, sparking debates and changes in policies regarding eyewitness testimony and access to evidence. Devon didn't shy away from the spotlight. Instead, he used his story to advocate for those who didn't have the same opportunity to fight back. He spoke at rallies, met with lawmakers, and shared his experience with anyone who would listen. His journey was a reminder to everyone who heard it. Justice is not just about punishment, it's about truth, fairness, and humanity. It's a fight worth taking on, no matter the odds. As Devon stood before a crowd one evening, his voice strong and unwavering, he reflected on how far he'd come. This isn't just my victory, he said, looking out at the sea of faces. It's a victory for everyone who believes in a better system, a fairer world. Together, we can push for change. And as the sun set behind him, casting golden light across the gathered crowd, Devon felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, hope. Not just for himself, but for the countless others still waiting for their day in the sun.